Good night, everyone. Thank you all for the opportunity to present our work. Yeah, my paper is titled Data-Centric Approach to School Discipline, where we aim to develop a quantitative metric to assess violence in schools and predict future trends. So, a bit of motivation into our research. The school environment plays a vital role in the development and the future opportunities of students. So it's very important that we optimize and manage the environment in a school. And violence is one of the key components of a school environment. So we the intention is to find a way to measure it, measure and quantify it. So previous research was done by Mercedes Kwame and others, and other people who created metrics to assess violence in schools, and all of them found a significant correlation between uh, school climate and academic outcomes. So the relevance of the study is profound. Um, Looking at current metrics, they do exist. We have metrics like the School Violence Intensity Scale, or VES, and the School Climate Survey that was done in Trinidad and Tobago by Mercedes Kwame. All these papers and metrics assess violence and climate in schools using a Likert scale, or a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, which students have the ability to indicate their agreement with a particular notion. These are extremely valuable. However, they are subject to the subjectivity and interpretation of students. So the different students may interpret violence in different ways. They may define violence differently. So there's potential for variation. So we aim to correct this by providing a quantitative metric which accounts for these differences. So yeah, to summarize the objective of our study, we aim to develop a composite metric that quantifies school violence. We use suspension data as a proxy or as an estimator of violent incidents in schools, and we want to compare it with the current approach that the Ministry of Education uses, which purely uses raw suspension, or the number of suspensions in a term that a school may have. And at the end, we look at some temporal and predictive analysis to hopefully preempt violence and take measures before they actually become an issue. So our methodology is as follows. The data we used is suspension data from 116 secondary schools across Trinidad and Tobago for the academic year 2023-2024. So for some context, every single day, a number of students get suspended, and the Ministry of Education collects this data. It includes the length of suspensions, the severity, the number of times an offense was committed, and a whole bunch of other features that we were able to summarize. So the basis of it is that suspension duration equals severity proxy. The Ministry of Education prescribes the length of a suspension based on the severity on a scale of major, minor to severe, as well as the number of times an offense was repeated by a particular student. So a longer suspension would indicate either a very severe infraction or a student committing a minor infraction a large number of times. That was the basis of our metric. The advantages of using this over simply the raw counts is that we now have an approximation that accounts for severity. We also adjust by the school population and capture repeat offenses. Simply counting suspensions does not work. You might have two schools with the same number of suspensions, however, have vastly different number of violent incidents that is not captured, and we will see that in upcoming graphs. So this is the model that we were able to derive, which simply reads the number of suspension days for a particular time period over the population, the product of the population and number of days in the time period. So is number of suspension days divided by population times time. And then we then normalize it to increase interpretability. So R over R bar means that the average severity matrix is 1, and any school with a metric value above 1 would be determined to be of above average violence, and one with a metric value of below 1 is, of course, lower value. So lower violence. So my apologies. To summarize our findings before we look at the graphs, we have a school with an alias of Crestwood Secondary, which was found to be 6 times more violent using our metric. However, when comparing the ranking using simply suspension count, they were ranked 19th on the scale. We'll look at the graph soon. Similarly, with Silver Creek, which is also an alias, it had the most suspensions, or the highest number of suspensions. However, they were relatively lower violent incidents. So our metric was able to rank that lower. So it highlights the importance of normalizing by the size and the severity of suspensions. So these are the two graphs I want to highlight. On the left, what you're looking at is a ranking of schools based on how many suspensions they had over the entire time period. And on the right side is our ranking using the metric that we derive. The first thing I want to highlight is Crestwood, as I mentioned before, the green bar, as we see here. Using number of suspensions is pretty low on the list, and using the metric that aligns with severity, we see that it's actually the most violent school in Trinidad and Tobago. That also means that, violence per student is extremely high. The second thing I also want to highlight, which I found was pretty interesting, is that the red bars are what the Ministry of Education calls schools of focus. So these are schools that the ministry designated as needing greater intervention and greater monitoring by giving them extra security and health and safety personnel to attempt to curb violence. And we see that their method identifies more schools of focus higher on their list because they simply use the number of suspensions. However, when we account for population and severity, we see that these schools of focus are actually lower ranked, and that there are schools which are more violent and are not captured by the regular method of using raw counts. So I thought that was pretty interesting to point out. Moving on to another comparison that is interesting. We have two schools here, which we calculated to have a similar metric. They also had similar populations, but the distribution of their suspensions was notably different. So these schools had the same violence rating, as we would say. However, we see that the school highlighted in blue had a disproportionate number of violent incidents indicated by longer suspensions than the school in green. So this is another point to note that was interesting to find. Some things that we found which were unexpected. We saw that there's no strong correlation between violence and security staff. So we explored whether staff ratios and security personnel actually made a difference in the schools, and surprisingly, the schools which were assigned more security staff had 86 more violent incidents on average. This raises the conversation around causality and correlation versus causation, but this was one of the things that we found. And it indicates that, security may not have necessarily had the impact that they intended it to have. Finally, we looked at some temporal analysis and tried to forecast the violence in schools over a particular term using geometric smoothing and ARIMA. So we use geometric smoothing with an alpha value of 0.5, of course, with trend and seasonality applied. The general trend we saw with both ARIMA and geometric smoothing is that violence peaks during the middle of the term, and it's reduced during times like carnival or religious events. So even when the population of a school is lower, there's generally less violence. And the red dotted graph is the forecast that we used, that we derived from exponential smoothing. Coincidentally, exponential and ARIMA both had a mean squared error of 0.2, but you could see that the trend is approximately captured. Similarly with ARIMA, I should note that the graph you're looking at is the weighted score versus the term and the week of a school. So a value of on the x-axis of 1, 2 means term 1, week 2, or 2, 6 is term 2, week 6, and so on. But the point still stands. The trend is captured, violence peaks at the middle or beginning of the term and tapers off. And we were able to capture that with our predictions. So key takeaways from this work is that we were able to introduce an alternative, a more data-driven metric for measuring violence in schools that's not susceptible to the subjectivity and interpretation of violence that the others fall short by. And we're able to show how the current methods overlook some of the information that we are able to derive from the data using a more composite scale. And as well as the predictive analysis allows schools to implement more proactive policies, more proactive actions to curb decisions. In conclusion, composite metric means better insight, more quantitative data. We also highlight some unseen patterns and disproportionality in the current analysis methods. And one thing I definitely think would benefit this study is including demographic and academic performance data, which would not only complement the violence, but it would also allow us to have a better predictive analysis, which is based on actual features rather than just simply trends. So that's my presentation. Thank you guys. Take any questions now.
Thank you very much. I think that's incredibly impressive work and the sort of research that we need here in Trinidad and Tobago. Would anyone like to pose any questions? Yes, Mr. Mendez.
Hey, Nicholas, a great presentation. I
Thanks,
think it
Mr.
is in
Mendes.
ministry data. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's ministry data. So I'm wondering, uh, did you get the data in terms of just offenses that got suspensions, or do you know for sure they're specifically violent offenses?
These offenses were just suspensions. So the data that we have was a student that was suspended for whatever reason, and there was no
Yeah.
reason, as well as the length of the
Oh,
suspension.
so you have the reason. So you can switch between people probably just making noise, and well, that's kind of severe, I guess. But non-violent offenses that got suspension versus truly violent ones, you're able to separate that out.
Yeah, we definitely have that data.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, Liam.
Really nice presentation. My question is, how do you take into account attendance? Because my concern is a school with very high attendance may be overrepresented compared to one with very low attendance.
Yeah. So that was actually something we took particular care to account for. So the P in the equation represents the population that was attending the school, because when we were doing our initial exploration of the data, we saw that point that you just raised, that schools did have notably lower attendance. So the metric that we see calculated, the final metric, is number of suspensions per students in school, not per population registered. So attendance is captured in that calculation. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, but it's sort of a question towards Prof as well, given his experience. I think insights like these are crucial, especially considering when it comes to allocation of resources to solving critical problems like these. But like it kind of beckons on when we do research, how do we move on to the next step of actually applying this research to have a positive impact in terms of a nationwide scale, like rather than it just staying as research.
I
Uh,
think,
Prof?
For me, I thought I was gonna.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Sometimes we do research and we have no control over whether it's used or not. in industry, in most cases, they would use whatever we proposed. But that is an issue. We've done several things within UE that were not used. That is an issue that we have no control over. We could just propose things and hopefully it would be used in some form or fashion. The point I want to make, one point I want to make though, is in terms of well, okay, in this particular case, we want to thank the Ministry of Education for allowing us to use the data. Of course, Nicholas anonymized all the names, etc. So we don't stigmatize any particular school, but we're thankful for that. But it would be nice for us to get more involved in actually implementing some of these things in the ministries, because what you will find is this: there are lots of smart people in the ministries, but they tend to use off-the-shelf literature from other countries, and other countries might have done something, to measure, what we were trying to measure. They have a certain metric, but that metric applies to that country. It's not relevant to our country, and so the results you would get for us wouldn't be relevant. And you really need people like like researchers within the country who understands the problem and could come up with the parameters that matter to come up with a correct performance metric. So yeah, just because something was published and they got good results doesn't mean it applies to us. All right, their constraints, their requirements are different, and so although it's optimal for their purposes, it's not optimal for us. We have to take our constraints, our requirements, and optimize for our situation, and that's the tricky thing. The ministry, I wouldn't say ministries, but in general, companies, tend to say, all right, well, no, it has worked well in this particular country. They use this off-the-shelf tool, and we're going to use it. But unfortunately, that's not how things work. So coming back to Nicholas's problem, yeah, the way that came about is, we saw what was being done, and we thought we could do something different. And mathematical modeling is what we do. We model. We try to find a good solution to that model, and that's the thing. The model is the important aspect. All right, the solution is typically straightforward, but the problem formulation and the model that you come up with is what is important. If you miss important information in that model, then the solution you get could be optimal with respect to the model, but it's useless. All right, so just something for people to keep in mind. But yeah, but thanks, Nicholas. Nice work. And as I said, we've done well, as Nicholas mentioned, we've done other things with the Ministry of Education. So we're very, very happy to continue working with them. I think Ricarda is she's online here and she's doing stuff with the ministry as well as Mercedes. So hopefully we can do this similar things with other ministries in the future, but we'll see.
Of
All
course,
right.
yeah. Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you as well, Nicholas. Really good work there.